Good afternoon, and welcome to the Phillips Mill Foundation for the Arts inaugural Relativity Talks program. I'm pleased to welcome you to spring and pleased that so many of you have reserved a little time on this beautiful afternoon to take a moment for a creative, intellectual, and personal breath of fresh air. We're in for a real treat. We're going to be running this webinar with the assistance of Jill Arnaitis, who's here with us with our panelists, and we'll be taking questions via chat, and we'll have an opportunity at the end of this presentation to take questions and answer them with the panelists. My name is Brett Weber, and I'm the founder and president of the Phillips Mill Foundation for the Arts. I'm joined today by Katie Albert, our founding creative director and artist residency director. Katie envisioned this series in the very early days of the formation of the foundation and indeed the rebirth of the New Hope colony here. Together, we imagined a kind of reactivation of the colony's afternoon teas where artists and scientists and thinkers and makers came together to share connections to the world around them and to each other. We're launching virtually today, and in some ways it offers us a kind of intimacy to the participants that we might not even have in person, although I'll grant that we all yearn for that. Spring is a time of hope, and we remain hopeful about our opportunity to do just that later this year. For the time being, I should say that because of all of you and your support, the foundation and our membership continues to grow. It's with your support that we're able to make these and other programs like it possible, and membership is the most immediate way for all of you to engage and demonstrate support. Importantly, as a member, you'll receive advance notice about all of our programs and receive information about new initiatives, and keep in touch with us on our calendar as our events are growing. If you have questions about how you'd like to get involved or to assist more directly with our mission to save, preserve, and reactivate the New Hope colony here at Phillips Mill, please visit our website or visit me directly. You can also provide a contact inquiry in the chat, and we'll be happy to follow up with you. As a member, you'll also be getting newsletter information, which comes via email and mail for those that request it, and that's chock full of great events that are happening throughout the year and tracks the progress that we're making here at Phillips Mill. So without further ado, let me once again introduce Katie Albert to launch us into this conversation with Miya Ando and Susan Magsamen, and I give you Katie.
Thank you, Brett. Welcome everybody, and welcome to Miya and Susan. Especially, we're just so honored and grateful that you agreed to join us, help us launch this new thing. I think probably I should take a second to just explain the New Hope colony, what we think it'll be, what we hope it'll be, what it's becoming. Right now we have two key projects, I'd say. One is the Artist Residency, which launches on April 1st, and we're really excited to have these 10 incredible women join us for a residency that really features mentorship and professional development and financial support. And really we're creating a circle of support for them because being an artist is as hard as ever. And we just really, it's founded on the value that we can do more together than we can do alone. And we're going to bring that into more of that to you in the future. And the second product right now we're talking about is Relativity. And we said before that I think we introduced it as a series that will sit at the intersection of art and creativity, art and science and creativity. But you know, I really think it occurs to me that everybody is creative, and that sounds more binary than we mean it to actually be. These conversations stem from the certainty that we are all creative, and you know, even if we're not creative with a capital C, you know, it's there for all of us. And I think, you know, Susan will be able to speak to that so well because this is her existence really, and Miya from her own side as well. And you know, I come to this very naturally because my father was a composer and my mother is a neuroscientist. And I saw that these things coexist all the time. And I think my mother's work is very, very creative, and my father's work had a little bit of science to it. So I just think that helps illustrate what we want this to be. So at its core, we think this will be, I've started to say it's like the liner notes and not the record. You know, it's not going to be an artist talk with, as deep a dive and granular detail as those will be, though we're going to have those. And we're really excited to bring those to you in the future. It's really just going to be a time and space to shine a light on the amazing things these guests have done to gain access to the vision that only they see, their particular take on what interests them, what they've been challenged by, what they gravitate to, and also the inflection points that challenge us and force us to make shifts and what that means. So hopefully we'll just all get to listen in on these two people, tell us how they got here. So I agree with Brett, it's going to be a big treat, so let's get into it. I'm going to start by giving just brief little bio background on each of them, and then we'll dig in. So Miya Ando is a New York-based artist, most known for her, as you can see behind her, her landscape-inspired paintings. She's in her studio in Long Island City right now, and she also does sculpture works, and all of them are the focus, the centralizing sort of thesis is an intention to document transformations within natural systems, the natural world. And her work is largely focused on nature and its changes and its fragility. And her incredible work has been exhibited in art fairs, museums, and galleries all over the world. She's a scholar and a philanthropist and has been the recipient of several grants and awards, including the Pollock Krasner Foundation grant and a commission for the Philip Johnson Glass House, among many other things, too many to list. Susan is the founder and executive director of the International Arts and Mind Lab, aka the I Am Lab, and she's a pioneering neuroaesthetic initiative from the Peterson Brain Institute at Johns Hopkins. Her body of work, really, this is why I thought of her for this very first one. It lies at the intersection of brain sciences and the arts, and how our unique response to aesthetics really amplify the human potential. That is very much, I think, the belief of all of us at the Phillips Mill Foundation. So there's a natural fit there. And in addition to her role at the I Am Lab, she's an assistant professor of neurology at Johns Hopkins, and she's the co-director of the Neuro Arts Blueprint Project in partnership with the Aspen Institute. So all of that is a lot of stuff. And I would love to start with Susan to say, what does all of that mean? What's an average day in your life look like? What are the projects you're attracted to? What are you working on that's exciting to you?
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm really thrilled. I'm a long fan of Katie's, so it's really an honor to be asked to be part of this. And I love the community that you represent. I've been to New Hope many times and the general area, and I just think there's something magical about the nexus of that place. And so it's really, really an honor. So thank you. So what does my day look like, or what do I do? My work has been, and this has really been I would say my whole life, and I say that sort of, childhood forward, is really thinking about the role of nature and environment and how that changes us, how that transforms us, to use a word that Miya uses. And I think there's something really extraordinary about nature and its fragility and its change. But that work is very sensory, right? We bring the world in through our senses. So it's easy to understand how the things that humans make that are creative expressions are extensions of that natural world, but also ways that we can bring the world in and feel it first, and then understand it and create things and share it. So I'm very interested in the intersection of how our bodies change on art and aesthetic experiences. And by understanding that, how we can lift that up to really enhance our potential, make better connections, heal physically, heal mentally, grow and change. And so it's really honoring the artist, and I think nature. I often say that the artist got there first, the artists have known intuitively, I think since the beginning of time, how nature and the built environment, how arts change us and help us transform. So really, this is really in service of art for health and well-being. And I think it's just a really sort of extraordinary space. I'll add one other thing, that technology is really starting to provide us with new ways to see inside the head and body, to understand these complex mechanisms that are not only neurological, but also thinking about respiratory system or cardiac systems. And so the more we understand technology and how technology can help to be in service of this, I think it's really an amazing time ahead of us.
That's really interesting. And I'm curious to know how you found your way into this area. I know that we've talked and you've talked about from a very young age being involved with, I think you said it was Curiosity Camp. And I'd love to hear a little bit about if you can recall if there was like a moment that sent you in this direction, or some experience that was very formative.
Well, you've asked such great questions in preparation for today, and I've really reflected a bit over the last week or so. Interestingly, I mentioned that nature was always a real through line for me. I always felt very grounded and also awe-inspired in nature in different seasons. So I've always been, I picked mint, from, out in the fields. I would make clover chains for jewelry. I really was I grew up with horses. Something about smell for me has always been, scent has always been very powerful and very grounding. And even today, being the first day of spring, I picked some daffodils and I was just like, high on daffodil because it's just so powerful. So I think from the time I was a kid, it just worked for me. The smell of roasting, chestnuts or, anything that really had this kind of, the smell of a plant when you pick it. But when I was in fourth grade, my sister, I'm a twin, my sister had a really serious accident and broke her leg, compound fracture, and was sort of sidelined for almost 2 years in surgeries and healing. And she began to paint. And she discovered her ability to understand her depth of experiences through painting, through drawing and then painting. And she's an artist today. She has done a lot of work in clay, but then started writing children's books and is really a prolific artist. And she's incredibly talented. But I was able to get to know her pain and her joy as a 10-year-old when she was really, her world turned upside down. And I started to see then that there was another way to communicate and another way to share through taking what was happening with you and bringing it forward in another form that wasn't verbal, that was visual. And I think the other piece of that was I've always been someone who could find ways to communicate by writing. And so I've always written poetry. I've always done collage. I've always been a maker. So when you're talking about artists and scientists and thinkers and makers, I would have to say I'm more of a maker. And I'm not good at anything. And in the sense of being an artist. So, there's people that look at work and say, oh, that's a fantastic piece of art. I've never aspired to that. But I think what we're seeing now is that you don't have to be good at it in order to have tremendous benefit from creating and making. And so one of the things that I think has really been sort of a through line for me too is that making is just joyful, and it's so much about finding meaning and understanding each other, that when we take away the, is it good or not, we pull a veil away and I think can be more intimate with each other. And that's also been something that I've seen just throughout my life, is how people make and create and without judgment, just understanding what people are saying.
Perfectly said. And if we're talking about somebody who is really good at making, I think that, and dealing with nature, obviously, Miya, we're going to talk to you. I'm interested, I think that so much of your work comes from, if I may say broadly, your hometowns. So I'd love for you to share a little bit with this group. It has always sounded to me like they're very formative. There's a really strong golden thread from the places you grew up to where you are now and the work you do. So can you share a little bit about that with us?
I wanted to say thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here, and it's very exciting to be, and it's a big privilege to be part of this new effort. I'm very, very pleased about the residency and the women that have been selected. So it's really lovely to be here. I I was raised in sort of two different, very distinct, possibly disparate places. One is 25 acres of redwood forest in the Santa Cruz Mountains in California. The other place is a small, tiny Buddhist temple in Okayama, Japan. I'm of mixed race. I'm half Japanese. My Japanese grandfather was a Buddhist priest in Japan. And I think that as I was growing up, my sister and I were really the first half part Caucasian people in our hometown. And being of mixed race, there are prejudices from both places. I don't look 100% Japanese. So there are some isolating factors. And when I was a little child, I thought that the one thing that is a connected thread is nature. And there was something about that that really struck me. Clouds are the same in Japan as in the redwood forest, for example. But there is a certain conditioning there's a very, very high emphasis placed on nature in Japan. Japan is very distinctive. And there is an indoctrination, and Japanese culture really requires one to have an attunement and an appreciation to nature. And nature, because of the Shinto native religion, nature is deified, nature is sacred. And living out in the country, I really absorbed a lot. My grandmother would wear kimonos that depicted there are 72 ancient seasons instead of 4 seasons, or instead of even 24 Chinese seasons. It's further categorized into very, very distinct seasons. It's quite refined. The attention to the small shifts in nature. Again, there is a reverence that I guess it's very much a part of my upbringing, but I believe that as well. Growing up in the wild, really 25 acres of redwood forest, there's a sort of an awe in nature, I think a perception of awe that has always remained with me. And so it's quite interesting to listen to Susan, because we all have our own relationship to nature, and it belongs to us all. The egalitarian quality of nature is very appealing. It is not, it has nothing to do with heritage or race or color or age or anything like that. It's just look up. There's your cloud right there. It belongs to you, it belongs to me, it belongs to no one. So I have been drawn to the vernacular of nature in my art practice. And I'm sort of programmed, I would say, that way due to my own conditioning. Yet, less about my own sort of what I bring to my practice is that this vocabulary, I hope, engages a nonverbal dialogue with viewers and their own relationship and their own history to nature and what they bring. So everyone has a relationship to nature. We remember that sunset, remember when that big rainstorm. So there's a component of nature. It's sort of become the vernacular that I use to, I think of artwork as thinking. It's just thinking. It's artwork as a residue of thoughts. And my thoughts are sort of explained with this vocabulary of nature and clouds, and for the most part, quite ephemeral things, transitory things in nature that are just about to shift. And there's quite a beautiful word in Japanese, which is called mono no aware. And mono no aware means a recognition of impermanent things. And there is a wistfulness or a somber quality to the recognition that was so beautiful, that wave or that lunar phase or that cloud, that mist or that fire, and how lucky I was to sort of bear witness, and that it's past. And there is this sort of a gentle kind of sorrow that is a recognition that all things share it. So this is a combination of Shinto and Buddhism. Buddhism, the main foundation idea of Buddhism is that all things are impermanent. You are impermanent, I am impermanent, this room is impermanent. And so there's a psychological shift that occurs in that instead of the recognition of all things being temporal and our lives being finite, that the psychological shift is an acceptance and an appreciation of that. So there's a shift that occurs there in that recognition. So I investigate this idea through a number of drawings and paintings and whatnot.
And in the materials you use as well, right? I mean, I think that's an interesting kind of layer to it, that you're not just depicting this, right? You're using the materials that are also have their own tradition and history and are part of nature.
Well, everything is from nature. Everything is from nature. I mean, we dig cobalt out of the ground for our cell phones. So we think that perhaps in this technological age that we are separate and far from nature, but we are not only caretakers of nature, but we are part of the animal kingdom. And so there is something about, I think about materials very, very carefully, and there is always an appropriate material for that idea, and a material that viscerally supports an idea. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about what that particular material may be. The execution typically ends up being a vocabulary of paradox. So very transitory clouds depicted on industrial aluminum, for example. I've selected aluminum in particular for this Kumo cloud and Unkai Sea of Clouds painting series that you may have seen or may not have seen, but the aluminum has an innate nature that is quite unique. It has the ability to redirect light. And so that starts becoming a dialogue about the transitoriness of light, and whether it's a conscious thought or not, fleeting light through a reflected from a panel of metal is about that moment. It is about an awareness to this very moment. And so it is a way to communicate time and temporality with the addition of, for example, clouds have always been some of my favorite vocabulary for evanescence. I do work behind you here. These are new works. I'm working currently with natural indigo in Aizome. Ai is Japanese indigo, but indigo, natural indigo, has been used for over 6,000 years globally. And I am using it in the same exact way that it has been used historically, which is to take the leaves. It's a bushy plant. Dry the leaves, ferment the leaves, and once the substrate is placed within the indigo, or the indigo on the substrate, and oxidized, which means that the oxygen in the air impacts the indigo. A chemical reaction occurs and the indigo becomes a permanent resident of that substrate. So I have been working with kozo, which is from a mulberry tree of its bark. So these beautiful handmade kozo papers from Japan were living on a tree as their bark a couple of years ago. And the indigo, of course, is a plant. I also, on these particular drawings, which depict the moon in phases and the relationship to the tides, I'm also using micronized pure silver. And so there is a dialogue. All silver, from, as most people know, comes from a dying star. So the supernova creates precious metals, heavy metals simply fall to the earth. And so there is a dialogue of natural elements, and perhaps an investigation into an amalgam of elements. So yes, I work with a number of different types of materials, elemental materials.
Right, that's what I guess I've caught wind of. But and you've spoken so beautifully about the big, some of these really important influences in on your personal and professional vocabulary and vernacular. Susan, I'm curious to know about yours. I know there probably are these sort of, you can now, and I think maybe not when we're in the middle of it, but now that we're on this side, and I think it's on a year into the pandemic, many of us have had some time to reflect on, what's the most important, and maybe it's sent us in a new direction, but I'm curious to know what are some of the most important influences on your professional vocabulary?
No, that's a great question. And I love hearing, Miya, you talk about how deeply you think about your work. I think that's also a thread to a lot of the work that we do, and honoring how every individual has that conversation with themselves about how they show up in the world and what's important to them. And I think hearing you open that up from your, as you mentioned, conditioning, culture, life experiences, those are things that I think we each explore in terms of our language of humanity, our individual language of humanity, and we don't often share it because either we're so transactional that we don't have time to do it, or we don't think that it's important to do it. But I love that you let us see that in your work and how you think about your work, and then to see your work, I think it's so wonderful. I think part of my vocabulary in this last year has been around agency and individual decisions and power and embodiment of self. I've seen that in whether we're working with people that have some kind of physical issue that they're using the arts in some way for, or there's been so much mental health issue this year. Frontline workers have experienced so much PTSD and trauma, and so have many others who have had great loss and fear and anxiety and all the things that have come with the pandemic. And then mixed in that, I think there has been sorrow and with joy. And so, we had 2 of our children get married this year. And so, it's figuring out how you dance the weather. I think it's another really interesting aspect of the metaphor of nature is that weather is always happening, right? It's always changing, and the patterns are moving, and it does change. And again, Miya, I think you're talking about 72 cycles of nature, thinking about that things are transitory, and that when we're stuck, we're never really stuck because things are always moving, right? They're always moving, and allowing for that. So I think that's been part of the vocabulary too, is that things are changing and do change, even if they're not, even if you're passive, there's still an activeness around you that's happening, and how things affect each of us has been a big theme. I also think another big connection has been this idea around one side of the coin would be loneliness, the other side is human connection. So we are socially distanced, but in some ways what we really are, it's physically distanced and in need of each other so desperately. So we are doing this, right? We're doing these kinds of connections because we need it so much to be healthy, to be strong, to survive. And so that's been part of the vocabulary, is just understanding and honoring this sense of the other, needing each other so much. And then being very interested, not in being like the other, but in understanding differences. And I think we've seen that with Black Lives Matter. We're sadly seeing it with the hate crimes this last week, where there's all kinds of reactions and responses to so much chaos in the world. And I think that's all sort of it's so very raw. I think the world is very raw and very tender right now, and in great need of understanding and listening and healing. So those are some of the things that I sort of have been thinking about over the last year.
Mm-hmm.
I think, Susan, it's really interesting, the idea of art as healing, and as so many things that you said resonated. In particular, art, by its very sort of, I don't know, meaning or purpose, function, is communication.
Mm-hmm.
And this art is not, it isn't a soliloquy, it's a dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've always thought about this notion that to be participant in either of those sort of way, in viewing works, and you feel something quite profound with works that you see, and it may or may not be what the artist was thinking. And I don't know if that matters necessarily. It's what you bring, what we all bring, our history, our own experiences to that. And by seeing something and that interconnectivity, perhaps someone made it hundreds of years ago, but that non-verbal dialogue is what I think keeps me interested in creating, to make and show, and not just make, but to show and to participate, even if that may not be. I think I'm a very I'm probably a cliche, because I'm very happy to be in my studio making things. That's very easy for me. But this notion of the things we see change our state of mind. And when you were speaking, it reminded me of why I became an artist. And when I was a little girl, 3-4 years old, in the Buddhist temple, this is definitely before I can read, maybe barely talk, not so much. I didn't really speak that much, but my grandfather would have, my Buddhist priest grandfather would, during services, I would see the countenance of all of these very pious people in prayer, and they would look at all of the Buddhist iconography. And I didn't know exactly what they meant, but I knew it meant something, and they were looking and as a meditation aid and as a part of this religious ceremony. Now, I've also in Japan uh, had the fortune of visiting a Zen temple where all they had is an Enso circle, which is just a giant circle. And so this, when I was in college and in graduate school, looking at the way that iconography can, this is a visceral sensory experience, can change our state of mind. And so during this very strange past year, I was in my studio every night making a drawing of that night's moon as a way to comfort myself. It was, and that's what art is for me. It's very therapeutic. I resolve things as a practice. It's almost a moving meditation. It always has been for my own. During COVID, it was quite, as we all experienced, quite frightening, very lonely, very isolating. The trepidation and the anxiety and the paradigm shift. And so on March 15th here in New York, when we had our lockdown, that was a paradigm. I've never been told to go home. I've been in the studio 7 days. I'm a New Yorker. I work very hard. I work all the I love. And so this was the start of a new era. And I thought I will make a calendar now of, now the calendar is over 367 days of drawing that night's moon to reiterate to myself that the world may be on fire, but the moon still comes and it goes through its lunar phases and it's there comforting me, and my mom is looking at the same moon, and those things, and to be able to perhaps share these works. The little tiny drawings turned into giant big drawings now, but it's the same. I continued on the same group to perhaps share those works and to communicate with people. Perhaps they will say, "Oh, I understand. I felt somehow this way," and I think that that is a yearning and a seeking that I myself have, perhaps viewers as well.
I love that. I think, you know, the constancy of the moon it's while it's above, it's also below, right? It grounds you to the earth, and moon is so feminine, right? It's such a womb in its way. And I think we've needed that. When you see people go outside and sing together on balconies when they're locked down, you know, when Notre Dame was burning, people stood together and sang in sorrow. I've seen some beautiful dancing in lockdown with kids at the end of their driveways and with amazing dancers who are just dancing on video, and you can feel the anguish and the fear and then the release. And so your point about nonverbal, the arts in all of their forms as being beyond words, right? You can never put humanity into words as hard as we try. My husband and I were talking yesterday, and we were like, what was the first Nobel Prize in literature? And I was like, I don't know. So we went back and we looked at it, and the first Nobel Prize in literature was a Frenchman who was explaining the arts and science together. And he was the person that, and he couldn't find words. You know, he was a poet, and then he was like, I need to try to understand this. But he was in this quest of trying to bring different worlds together, kind of, Katie, like your mom and dad, you know, it was like this marriage of opposites, which I also think is part of what makes this work so interesting, is there is a yin and a yang to it. So I love, and your work is so amazing. I know one of my children who works at Hopkins, we started writing poetry together, lyrics, I guess. And we're not poets, right? But we wrote these hysterical things because it was our way of trying to go, just to try to ground ourselves. And so I think it's beautiful to see extraordinary art. Like your work is just, I'm just drawn to the images. And then to see people's work that is just heartfelt, and I think it has the same quality of healing from a different point of view.
I think that those ineffable things, so many things in life, are difficult to articulate and are difficult to communicate. And perhaps, well, things, when one feels isolated or does not have the capacity to write or verbalize in those ways, then art is there. And the visceral, the way we comprehend things with our bodies and our minds and our eyes, there is a egalitarian quality that we can look at something, we can look at things together, and we don't even need to talk about it. And they may bring something else up for you as they will for me. But within this idea of the moon, it belongs to us all. It's our best friend. It's there every night. If it's a new moon, it will be up the next night. And there is, at least for myself, a re-examination of the importance of non-material enlightenment and harmony, where there is such a focus on tangible material enlightenment and betterment. And then there is nature that we all have access to. Even if you're somewhere, I'm in the city, we do have sky, we have stars, but just a little bit. And there is a means to heighten all of our perceptions of what that relationship is. It's really a relationship to yourself. So there is an opportunity that we all have access to it. So there is something, I think that maybe what I am hoping is for an opportunity or a moment. It's really just a moment for to share works that perhaps can invite this type of more really focused, slowed down examination of time and nature. That really, it's kind of slowing ourselves down, which COVID has been, it's been wonderful for, because everything's slowed down so profoundly.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I want to just take a quick minute to see, I see that there are a few questions. Jill, would you feel like reading them so that we can make sure the audience gets their questions in too?
Sure, and I can also provide a little direction if anyone has a question. There are two ways you could submit it. One is by using the chat box or the Q&A box on your screen, or I'm also going to make it possible for you to turn on your audio. So if you have a question that you would like to speak verbally, just raise your hand and we'll make sure we get to everybody. Okay. Thank you. The first question was submitted by Barbara Donnelly Bentivoglio.
Bentivoglio.
Yes, that's it. It is, how do you think your work will change and or adapt to external event? Would you like me to read that again?
Oh, I'm sorry, is that for me?
I'm not sure who she intended it for. I'm guessing.
You can both answer it.
Sure. Probably. How do you think your work will change and or adapt to external events?
Well, you know, the works are about the zeitgeist. It's about, the works are a filter in thinking about everything that is going on. And so the works, each work comes out of the last work, and that sort of that thinking is impacted by, of course, current events. It's sort of part and parcel, I think, in the way that artworks are made, at least for myself.
That's a great question. So, when you're thinking about the marriage of science and art, there are, I think, some universal questions. So, we're really interested in understanding some of the mechanisms that underlie the physiology around how we experience aesthetics and the arts in specific art forms. And so there are some systematic things that have to happen. You need to be able to study those and build on top of the work of researchers. And so I think, we're really looking right now, music, it turns out to be an art form that is the most studied, and there's funding going in that work. And so I think we're seeing mechanistic work in music, other art forms too, but music quite a bit. There's a lot of work in visual systems and visual arts. There's some great people doing work there, but I think we're going to see a lot of the science of understanding some of these things increase and enhance over the next several years, because the arts, like nothing else, really are responding to a lot of the mental health issues that are happening because of COVID. So I think in the next several years, we will see more work around mental health in the arts, and that mental health that can be, so right now we're building several recharge rooms. So thinking about environments for frontline workers to be able to move into biophilic spaces for just relief for 15 or 20 minutes to really literally lower their physiology and relax and release in order to go back in to do their work. So I think there will be more basic science around that, and also clinical studies. And I think mental health is going to be hugely important. The other thing that we've seen is that, before the pandemic, there was a lot more talk about stigma around mental illness and mental health. And I think that conversation has broken open because everyone's experiencing some kind of distress, and that's across the spectrum. And so I'm hoping that the conversations about how do we renew, restore, ground ourselves through a lens of either the maker or the receiver of art becomes more enhanced, because we are so cracked open and we're so vulnerable that I think that's a possibility too.
It's interesting. So what is known at this time about these, did you call them recovery rooms?
Mm-hmm.
What elements are going to be at play there? Is it known at this point?
Yeah, there's a little bit. Well, it's interesting. The number one, so there's a lot of research on awe and wonder. Dasher Keltner at University of California, Berkeley has done some really amazing work there, looking at the parasympathetic nervous system. So really looking at the fight and flight responses, but also inflammatory system. So, when you're really stressed, one of the problems is there's a lot of inflammation that happens in the body. We know that nature lowers cortisol. Being in nature for just 15 minutes can have a huge effect on inflammation. And so this work is informing these recharge rooms. So we're really looking forward to it. Oops.
That's really interesting. It makes me think so, and I know from prior conversations with you that, so it sounds like that might have something to do with how you've been thinking about AI and virtual reality in the hospital. Does that, when you're talking about ODD, is that one of the connection points there?
It does. So in these recharge spaces, they're physical spaces that are filled with, there's a projection of nature actually. So there's these huge projection walls in both woodland areas, but also water, which are both known to be very calming. The number one, so we're doing a pre and post, just simple evaluation when people go in and come out. And what we're seeing, number one, sort of response to these spaces is gratitude, a sense of gratitude for time and for nature, and to be able to just have that reflection. not gratitude to the hospital or anything like that, but gratitude for the time in this sort of immersive experience. So we do know that virtual reality can be a way to get there if you don't have access to nature or you don't have time to get there. And so we are looking at virtual spaces and what happens in those spaces. And while they're not 100% as effective as being in nature or being in a space that simulates that, they are highly effective, and there are a lot of really positive biological responses to that. So we're looking at those as other ways. Virtual reality is being used very effectively for pain management as well. So when you're in an environment like an icy cold virtual space, and you have had a burn and your burn bandages are being changed, we think that there's a distraction, or the brain can't really do two things at once. So it's going to this virtual stimuli that is stronger, and it's helping to eliminate pain. And also, a side effect of that is less pharmacological, so less opioids, less painkillers. So it's an interesting partner in thinking about medical, how you attend to different kinds of health issues.
That's fascinating. And are you seeing virtual reality art come into that space? Is it primarily still, I don't know what else it would be. I mean, when you talk about visions of nature, I assume it's a little bit more direct, but are there?
No, but actually, some interesting places. Google Arts and Culture, which is a Uber space with over 2,000 cultural arts organizations, are using a lot of arts from collections to sort of think about health and well-being. Museums, museum artwork or artwork in hospitals are now being tied into tours where the art is used to help different types of, just explaining pieces of art. Physicians are using art to better understand both art and actually narrative. So in psychiatry and psychology, there are some things happening where a doctor will say, this patient, I reflected on this piece of art. I understood that that's what I was hearing, and sharing that with their other sort of colleagues, and then talking with patients to say, let's talk about this piece of art. Does this reflect the feelings that you have about your illness? And that can be lots of different kinds of illness. So using art as in dialogue to get closer to what someone is experiencing. And this is more in the mental health realm, but I think, sometimes things are very hard to express. So it's not like this piece of art, it's like this piece of art. You get closer to understanding somebody's deep meaning. So I think art is being used more and more, different kinds of visual arts.
Katie, I have a follow-up question, and there's probably two parts to this, but both Susan and Miya, I'd love to hear your feedback on it. And it's, I have my own personal views about the matter, but I'm curious, we've talked about the impact of art and relationship to nature as adults. And I'm just curious about your thoughts, personal and professionally, about how art through childhood development into adulthood has an impact on our ability to be empathetic, to be compassionate, to be connected to the natural world. And, I guess the larger question of how it impacts society. Different places in the world have different relationships. Miya, as you spoke so eloquently about Japan and the relationship to nature, but how art and nature through art impact us as we develop. It begs the question about the importance of having a kind of open and engaged relationship with art and art education in society. So if you could say a few things about that, and then I have another follow-up after that. So,
well, I can just say unequivocally, it is imperative that children are immersed in different types of nature and artistic aesthetic experiences. Certainly because of the developmental milestones that happen in early childhood and in adolescence. The creative process is incredibly valuable for executive function. It's very important, as you mentioned, empathy, but we're also starting to see from a sort of scientific point of view that children exposed to and engaged in art experiences build resiliency, and it's a protective measure, it's a preventative measure. So to be able to think about it not as a nice to have or as a skill building, necessarily being a great artist, but as a way of life, as something that's really important, like good sleep, good nutrition, exercise. This idea of making and creating and doing is physiologically incredibly important. And we haven't got there yet in the educational system. And we need to. We don't see it in that context. Then on the other end of the spectrum, thinking about communities, under-resourced communities, but also communities at large, I think benefit greatly in terms of their development when there's a sense of identity and culture. And that's what arts bring to community. And when you don't have that, you have instability in communities. I've seen it in African villages, and I've seen it in places where there's been huge natural disasters, or even war, or different types of crises, where art is what comes back to tell the story of what happened and to reknit the fabric of the community. I'll just say one more thing. The World Bank is starting to develop a hypothesis that without arts and culture, you don't have the foundation for economic development, that you have to have that in order to build and risk and try and change and to communicate what's of value in a culture. So, and whatever art form that takes.
Thank you. Miya, did you want to offer some insight in that regard?
Well, throughout the history of art, depictions of nature have been brought inside of spaces. You can argue that sort of, much of art is depicting nature and bringing it inside of from cave art to, I've been in, the European history of painting, and in Japan, in the interior of large temples and homes, you will see screens that depict, for example, my favorite one is all four seasons. So this idea of bringing nature in, which, when we have a flight into a city, when the capital is made and people leave an agrarian society and go into, and then there's this yearning, and it's sort of, there's quite a kind of an egalitarian quality to this yearning as well, where people feel innately a comfort in seeing woodlands or trees or nature or ocean and whatnot, sort of furthermore, in my own tradition, within Buddhism, there is Zen Buddhism, which has used nature, the moon, ocean, to add something very ordinary that anyone can relate to. We all know well, not all of us, but hopefully most of us know what the ocean looks like and the moon looks like, or a field looks like, to discuss things of a more philosophical nature. So a moon, the dewdrop in a scoop of water, and things of that nature. And so I feel quite drawn to that. And I think it of course, there is so much, again, about a non-verbal or ineffable communication that is what is experienced in nature for children, and those systems, and whether it's conscious or not, it is that attunement to systems and that seeing the harmony and sometimes asymmetry in nature. So things are not perfect, and perhaps ultimately cultivating an empathy for those things and finding a connection to that we are part of these systems. And so that I'm looking specifically in my own experience now, not only at transitory moments in nature, but but sort of on a macroscopic level, the fragility of our climate and the fragility, just in a crucial phase where now this ultimately is a violence onto the earth and ourselves. Climate change is a violence, it's an act of violence. And the notion of not being, of thinking we're so separate from nature, or we don't live in, perhaps we don't live near nature, perhaps we, that disconnection, deprogramming can have all sorts of negative things. And so I'm looking very carefully at that just within my own practice.
That's beautifully said. And I was really hoping that you would come to those points, because I think that one of the things that COVID has drawn out of all of us somehow is this sort of innate, very visceral response to being cooped up and wanting to get out into nature. I mean, I have the pleasure of working with parks organizations and just seeing people driven into the parks in droves and reacquainting themselves with nature. And I guess one of the things that I wanted to touch on that you've touched on, which is the if I sort of go out on a limb and sort of assessing things, I mean, I think the beauty of the kind of work that you do, Miya, is essentially stating in these very nonverbal statements essential truths. And I think one of the challenges about science in this moment in society too, for Susan, is, and one of the things that I would love to get into our lexicon is that we don't talk about belief systems when we talk about science, because it's not a religion. There are objective truths in the world. And I think there's a truth about nature and the natural world. And there's a kind of urgency for us to accept and adopt the truths. I accept these truths to be self-evident. It's the kind of thing that I think we need as a society. And art has the power to communicate that forcefully and draw us to the scientific world, which is essentially the natural world all around us. That includes all of us as citizens. But I think the work that both of you are doing is, in this incredible convergence to that. Thank you both for your insight on that.
Well, if I may, my I guess you could call it my life thesis. The thesis that I'm working on in my life is a comparison of two different traditions. One is the idea that the fundamental nature of reality is that all constituent forms that create the universe are temporary. This is Buddhist thought. This is the foundation thought of all sects of Buddhism. This has been around for a very, very long time. More recently, within the past 100 years, we have been able to prove scientifically a component of quantum mechanics lets us know that all things are impermanent. This is the same idea. This is what I was working on in graduate school. It is what I focus on examining this idea. This is a scientific concept. Is it? There's a Buddhist concept? Is Buddhism scientific? Buddhism is a philosophy. It's a system of thought that is proven in various ways. So looking at what our perception of truth is, nature becomes a mirror. It really becomes something that things are proven, things are explained, are examples, illustrations within nature if we look very closely in a slowed sort of way. And so, Susan, I'm sure you have something very interesting about this also.
Well, Miya, I could listen to you all day. So
please don't.
I told you I would just be like, I just met this amazing woman. No, I love what you're saying. I love what you're saying. The only thing I'll add is that I think to Brett, you're talking a little bit about the politicizing of nature, right? The almost weaponizing of things that should never be weaponized. And I think that nature is totally egalitarian. It's totally democratized. It's available to all of us. There should be access. It should be free. It should be affordable, and we know that it has great impact. And so, to me, that we have not been able to get beyond it being an argument about whether there is climate change or not climate change, or that nature is important, is a false choice. It's a duality that is only hurting us. And I think we have to find other ways to talk about it. I also think there's a thing around the psyche here that when you don't believe there's enough to go around, there is a certain mindset, that an austerity model, where if I'm not getting it, then somehow I'm not going to survive. And I think that I think art by nature is generative. It's about creating. And I think the more we look at a generative model around nature and the arts, and when I say nature, I think of aesthetic experience, smell, touch, sound, taste, all of those things, how something feels. I think the more we can make it less political and more about, it's a human right. I think that's the point, is that it's a basic human right. And that's where I think we need to move. And, the World Health Organization, in their sustainability goals, identifies environment as a human right. And I think we need to keep looking at true north, our greater good, and thinking about how we start to continue to frame that in policy and funding in all the different sectors, whether that's, healthcare, workforce, schools, that we need to make sure that those are sort of the guiding principles. And I like your term, essential truths. I think, there are essential truths, essential principles that I think we all can agree to.
And I think the guide for me is that natural systems are completely interconnected, and we're a part of that natural system. So this interconnectivity demands that we pay attention to that. So thank you both. Katie, do we have other questions?
We do. We have an additional related question from the audience, from William Bolton. And it is, has the transitory and impermanent qualities of nature informed any of your thoughts on aging? In the West, aging is treated as a disease, but in nature, it just happens and people aren't so hung up on it. This is for both artists or whomever would like to answer.
Wow. Well, I guess I could talk a little bit about that. Well, I think there is physical aging, and I think the perception of aging in the Western world is devaluing wisdom and life experience, and it tends to be very physical, right? It's really, we see that with women probably more than men, in terms of, what is beauty. And I think our definitions of beauty have gotten controlled by other narratives that aren't necessarily our own. And so, I think there's a lot of perception around that area that is worth reconsidering in the Western world. I also think that we're aging better. We're healthier, we're more active. I think there's a sense of vitality in aging. People say 70 is the new 40. I think we are more vital, we are healthier. And so I think that's really important. In other countries, you can go to a place to dance and it's all ages. Here, if you go to a place to dance, it's 20 to 30-year-olds. And so, I think we have a lot we can learn from other countries about how you think about life across quality of life across the lifespan. You know, we know a lot about Alzheimer's and dementia and the aging brain and what's good for the aging brain in terms of cognition. And a lot of that has to do with movement and dance and sound and, you know, music. And so I think there are things that we know about the arts that are going to help us as we age and thinking about quality of life and, you know, even palliative care and end of life, you know, sort of beautiful end of life. So I think we're continuing to gain knowledge there.
Susan, you said something really interesting about the Western perception of beauty and as it pertains to age, as the aged things become imperfect and that is no longer beautiful. And there is the sort of what I would consider an exact opposite in the East, which is this notion of beauty being something that you feel inside. And there is something that I've very, very been focused on examining in the work, which is that beauty and impermanence are inseparable. Falling cherry blossoms are a really good example, falling leaves or quickly changing things, ocean waves, that it's so fleeting, it's beautiful. It's so beautiful, it's fleeting. There's something, because why one has empathy, oh, it's gone. So it's as if it were sentient. It's as if there was something that, oh, it's there. It's sort of this something you adored and then it's gone. And there's a love there. And instead of a Western ideal of something being just perfect, there's love in the notion of beauty that I'm very fond of this idea. There's a Japanese idea, sabi. Sabi is something withered. The more withered, the more old and aged, and it has now this long history. So when, for example, my mom is a teacher of urasenke, the Japanese tea ceremony, the bowl falls by accident in some dramatic or non-dramatic circumstance. Something occurs, the bowl falls, the bowl is repaired, and gold is inlaid into the crack. Kintsugi or ginsugi, as the silver, is inlaid to show how beautiful the history of that. Oh, it is even more beautiful now because it has this history. There's an empathy for that thing. There's a thing that there's something that it's vulnerable, and there is something quite beautiful, but it's an internal notion. And I've growing up in Japan and America, I have noticed when I go back I was in Japan November and December for an exhibition, and there are all of these elders who are people who make paper. The people who are the best at making the washi have been doing it for 55 years, and you see them and I miss seeing those people. I don't see those people in the media in the United States when I come back to America. And I think what a pity, because there is, I feel a sense of perhaps this notion of beauty. We can examine that. Why do we think young is the most beautiful, when I think one of the most beautiful things I've seen is an 85-year-old woman rocking pulp. And she was the most beautiful woman because it was just so gentle and expert. It was so beautiful. It makes me feel teary.
Yeah. I think I love what you said about perfect and beauty. And you know, makes me think of when perceptions of beauty are portrayed as youth, only youth, or that aging is you know, somehow less than. I think there's a sense of self-loathing and shame that people take on that minimizes individuals, and it's probably one of the most tragic things is to not value a life well lived or life lived in all of its forms, right? And so it's definitely something that would be maybe coming out of the pandemic, we start to see maybe that's another aspect that we start to understand more, is that, you know, there's real value there, that, you know, we've seen the pandemic hit aging population the worst, right? And so, you know, where, you know, how can we redefine our values and what we hold to be? People have lost so many older loved ones, and you know, sometimes that can be a catalyst. But I totally agree with you. Yeah.
Well, I think just because of the time, we might have to start to wrap this up. I, like you, Susan, could listen to both of you talk all day. And I hope I speak on behalf of everybody in saying thank you so much for this wonderful, letting us eavesdrop on you and sharing your incredible insights and ideas with us. I forgot to say one very important thing at the beginning. I just want to make sure I do call out that Miya is one of our ARC members, which means that she's one of 10 amazing women who we went to and asked to help us find our 10 first residents. So she said yes, and she gave us one of our wonderful residents who is online here with us today. And we're so excited that we'll be starting this residency on April 1st together and just making something new out of the past too. You know, it's all, everything we're doing here at the New Hope Colony is really a reference to the original colony in some way. There's always a callback, and this residency is that too. We're launching with 10 women, which is a call out to 10 of the women who formed a group that was called the Philadelphia 10. Is that right, Brett?
That's right.
I think I've gotten that wrong before, but I was reading about them. You know, you can't always believe Wikipedia. I'd gotten a little piece of the history wrong, but there were these 10 women who had come through the colony and been residents, and also then went on to form the Philadelphia 10. And I loved that idea of really launching with this strong female force, because in museums and galleries, women are just so underrepresented. And I thought, well, we can do what we can to start to change that for galleries and museums in the future. So Miya has given us one of our first residents, and thank you for that. And thank you for joining us, both of you, for joining us today. Thank all of you for coming on what is probably a lovely Sunday everywhere. Do you have anything else you'd like to add, Brett?
Well, it's really been a pleasure, and you've both been very generous with your time. And Miya, thank you especially also for your Art Council membership. It's really an example of the kind of continuum of psychic energy and thought and creativity that we feel resonates and resides at this place, whether it's virtually or physically. And we know that you'll have some physical engagement at some point in the future. So we look forward to both of you coming. So Miya Ando, Susan Magsamen, thank you both so much. And thank you, Jill, for helping coordinate this, and Katie, to you for being the creative driving force behind all of this. It's a great partnership, and I'm honored to be able to have you on board and work with you. And I want to thank all of our attendees today. This is so important. It's such important stuff for us to do to reach out to the larger community and for members to support this. And we look forward to welcoming you back here again in the near future. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.